I mean, it's interesting to kind of compare rebuilds just across the league, I think, over the past, 10 or so years, because there's been quite a few that have really worked out. There's been some that have not worked out, and there's been some that kind of just kind of landed in the middle. I think for the Jazz, you're looking at a market that is probably the expectation is not that, top tier free agents will sign in Utah. And so therefore, the onus goes on building through the draft. And, once those trades were made a few years ago, Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert trades, all of a sudden you have a surplus of draft picks. And no real cornerstone at the time. Lauri Markkanen kind of broke out, became an all-star, and now has become a cornerstone. But once those trades happen, you're looking, what is the best way to get players like that again for a new version of the team? And for the Jazz, realistically, it comes in the draft.
The Jazz are kind of an interesting team because, we talked in our season preview where, it looks to be like a rebuilding year, but if you look in the standings right now, the Jazz are playing, I think, above a lot of people's expectations. What's your take on that? What's your take on the state of the Jazz and what their goals are for this season?
Yeah, I think it is still very much a building year. I think the focus is still building through the draft, developing the 7 or 8 young players in their rotation. I think their night to night rotation right now, I believe off the top of my head, is 7 players that are 22 or younger. Injury to Walker Kessler, who 24, has kind of taken a hit for the young core this season. But I still think very much the focus is the young core, developing that talent, continuing to build through the draft, and then hopefully kind of the young talent on the team keeps growing. You add another dynamic player in the draft, this year. You've got guys like Lauri Markkanen, Walker Kessler, and then I think from there you kind of look at, well, what does this team need around what we've got? And I think that is very much the state of the team overall, big picture. The early season success, has been maybe a surprise to some, but also, they've had a couple guys take some big steps forward. Lauri Markkanen has been, for the most part, back to his all-star level. And, the Jazz have had a relatively easy schedule in the grand scheme of things. So that's how you get a 4-7 record so far. But I think, moving forward, big picture, it is still very much trying to build this thing up a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to see Lowry as that one of the world all-stars. And that world all-star team is going to be unbeatable. But, I digress.
I'm curious too, Eric, your thoughts just kind of how the Jazz are doing this rebuild, because we saw a rebuild in Boston with Danny Ainge that, eventually kind of laid the groundwork certainly for that title Celtics team. There was, of course, this unique situation there where they could stay towards the top of the Eastern Conference while they were kind of simultaneously doing that rebuild. Is Ainge, do you see similarities in his approach with the Jazz?
I mean, it's interesting to kind of compare rebuilds just across the league, I think, over the past, 10 or so years, because there's been quite a few that have really worked out. There's been some that have not worked out, and there's been some that kind of just kind of landed in the middle. I think for the Jazz, you're looking at a market that is probably the expectation is not that, top tier free agents will sign in Utah. And so therefore, the onus goes on building through the draft. And, once those trades were made a few years ago, Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert trades, all of a sudden you have a surplus of draft picks. And no real cornerstone at the time. Lauri Markkanen kind of broke out, became an all-star, and now has become a cornerstone. But once those trades happen, you're looking, what is the best way to get players like that again for a new version of the team? And for the Jazz, realistically, it comes in the draft. And, it's hard, those Celtics teams, eventually are able to rely on the Nets picks that land super high to get them, Tatum and Brown. And it's hard to rely on another team's draft picks to be the ones that give you the success of your next team. It can happen. Obviously, the Thunder drafted Jalen Williams from one of their Clippers picks. But for the Jazz, it's not necessarily about relying on the Cavaliers or the Timberwolves picks, but more so you can control your own pick, and that's kind of the main way to go about getting that next star, to eventually pair with Markkanen and build with whatever else you've got.
Do you see also, I mean, it seems there's also a lot of parallels with what OKC just did, kind of building through the draft, kind of similar situation in terms of free agency that you just mentioned. And they also have, SGA broke out in OKC. You mentioned Lauri, who is breaking out in Utah now. Do you think it kind of naturally goes. You just see them win the title and see that as maybe a successful model as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think, the OKC model is one of the more unique because they, in their big trade that got them the surplus of draft picks from the Clippers, it also got them an MVP, which is, rare. The for as great as Lauri Markkanen has been for the Jazz, he has not reached that level. And I don't think anyone would expect him to reach, an MVP level. So in a way, the OKC model, can be somewhat of a reflection of what the Jazz could hope for. I also think, interestingly enough, the models of Detroit and Houston are also kind of similar, where it's like you try and build through the draft for several years in a row. You get some young talent through doing so. And then when you feel like the time is right, you add not maybe, top tier free agents, but you add guys that fit. The Rockets added Fred VanVleet, they added Dylan Brooks. Obviously they had a coaching change, and the Pistons added, Tobias Harris last year. They signed Malik Beasley, who had given them a great year last year, to surround their young players with veterans that can contribute in certain areas to just help the team overall. So I think like I said before, it's hard to compare rebuilds across the league, but I do think, OKC, Detroit, and Houston, each in their own way, could potentially be a model for what the Jazz are looking to do.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up those teams because another aspect that you touched on a little bit with the coaching change in Houston is coaching, right? So, Houston, players want to play for Ime. Will Hardy is a former lead assistant for Udoka. He's a young coach. They just extended him. What's the take on that? What does the front office see in him that's made them extend him despite, rebuilding and having, a pretty poor record over the past couple of years?
Yeah, I think, it's definitely one of the more interesting cases, in the league, of a coach who I think has, unwavering support from the front office. Just because I think, being able to watch every Jazz game and, even possession by possession basis, there's so many kind of unique wrinkles to the Jazz offense. And I think the way that Will has been able to kind of create this unique system that is basically, super reliant on off-ball actions, is tailor-made to Lauri Markkanen's skill set, but just the skill set that's on the roster. This is not a team that has a elite primary pick and roll creator, someone who's going to isolate and break down the defense and collapse the defense to kick it out for shooters. This is a team that has to kind of generate offense in unique ways, off-ball actions, having a 7-footer shoot, from 25, 26 feet. And I think, on the other end of the floor, the team has struggled defensively. I think that's kind of almost a given with young players in the NBA, with a few exceptions. But I do think that Will has been able to get players to play hard. And I think even guys that have left the team, when asked about him, have praised him for his ability to kind of command the locker room, create a unique offensive system, and kind of just try and establish a culture. I think that, the front office wants to have a consistent voice leading this kind of rebuilding phase. And they believe in Will as a tactician, as a leader, and someone who can do that. And that is how you get this kind of unwavering support, even despite the record that he has.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about building a culture, because I think that's such an important piece. And I think, so many teams kind of bounce from coach to coach to coach, particularly in the WNBA, but in the NBA, we've been seeing it too. You don't see that kind of continuity. There's not even an opportunity to become the next Popovich or the next Spoelstra when, you're only given a year to a year and a half and then you're yanked. So I will say, I think it's really cool to see that the Jazz have that confidence in Hardy. So yeah, just wanted to pipe in on that.
Do you think the scheme that you mentioned, that unique scheme that they run on offense, is something that helped the Jazz, like especially in that breakout season? I want to say 2 seasons ago, gosh, maybe it was three ago already, where the Jazz started at the top of the Western Conference. Was that Coach Hardy's scheme catching other teams off guard?
I think partly. I think a lot of that, the scheme and Lauri Markkanen's ascension, I think, go hand in hand. And up to that point, Lauri joins the Jazz after 1 year with the Cavs, where he is kind of playing in this really big lineup. Ironically, now Pistons coach JB Bickerstaff was coaching, and they play him at the three, which primarily he was playing at the four, sometimes the five, early in his career with the Bulls. But the Cavs had that really big front court, and they got Markkanen in restricted free agency, and so they wanted to play their best players, and they played him at the three. And he had some moments in his year in Cleveland, but I don't think he was used. He was not used in the way that the Jazz started to use him. And I think, leveraging his shooting, running him off a ton of off ball actions, just asking more of him. And he was able to deliver in that year. I think that did catch people off guard. Markkanen's ascension, the way that the Jazz play, they had other depth at the time as well. It wasn't just one guy on the team, but I do think that can be part of the reason that season, kind of caught people off guard was, this is a unique style led by a unique leading player on the offensive end in Markkanen.
It seems like since, the mid 2010s, it seems like the league and certainly the Jazz in this rebuilding phase has kind of learned the sort of dangerous practice of just all out, blatantly tanking. Like, you can bring up the 76ers team, the process, and what went through there. It seems like there's a little bit more of a handle and a genuine focus still on making a coherent team and then driving the progression forward any way you can, even if on paper you are more often going to be overmatched compared to your competition. Is that something that you would agree has been kind of maybe not unique, but a newer spin on, because I wouldn't say the Jazz are tanking just based on the effort that's being put forth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think teams kind of started to realize that, just rolling the ball out there with all of your youngest players at one time is just not a good environment for growth. Veterans are vets in the league because they've been able to stay in the league for enough time for a reason. And, they have different skill sets, they have different ways of leadership. But oftentimes having a few vets in your rotation can make the difference. I mean, you can still find a way. Like I said before, the Jazz are still playing a ton of young guys this season. But they do have a few vets, obviously Markkanen, Yusuf Nurkic is now their starting center. Svi Mikhailuk is in the starting lineup and has provided, some good minutes for them. Guys that, especially those latitude, don't necessarily jump off the page or people aren't going to get super excited about, but they provide, fundamental skills that can help a younger player be in the right position on the floor or set up a young player for an open shot or knock down shots, after a young player like Isaiah Collier setting them up. So I do think on court, there are a lot of reasons, for veterans to have roles on younger or rebuilding teams. And then obviously off the court, you do want some guys who have been in the league for a long time and know what it takes to win or how to approach each night or just how to approach an 82-game season. These young guys come in at 19 years old, having played a 35-game college season, and now they're playing 82 games in the NBA. So I do think teams are kind of getting more in on the value of vets on and off the court, and the idea that you can't just field a roster of only young players with two vets at the end of the bench that don't even play and just expect that all of these young players are going to grow just by playing around with each other. I think you need kind of that environment for growth, and a lot of times that comes from having a few veterans on and off the floor.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we've seen that kind of come to fruition with OKC, Houston, Detroit as well. Speaking of 19-year-olds, though, my Twitter feed this morning was full of praise for one particular 19-year-old. And I wanted to get your thoughts on Ace Bailey and kind of what his progress has been. And and what he brings to the team.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're talking now after probably his two best games of the season. He joined the starting lineup Monday night. And the Jazz had a back-to-back, and so last night he had 20 points, was knocking down threes consistently for the first time this year, which I think is the main thing. Is people are focused on shots aren't falling, and his on-off numbers have been really bad so far this year. But I think it's more about the little things that he's shown. I mean, right away from the first summer league game, he showed that he can have a real impact on the offensive glass, and he can just kind of use his athleticism and his length to get second chance opportunities for the Jazz, whether he's putting the ball back or not. I mean, he might be resetting it for another 14-second possession, but the offensive rebounding has stood out. I think his playmaking has actually been pretty impressive. I mean, obviously he did have this kind of reputation entering the draft of just being score first all the time. And, he's averaging, I was looking it up this morning, he's averaging almost 3 assists per 36 minutes, which he's not a primary ball handler. He's not initiating the offense. These are kind of coming in the flow of the offense, and he's making quick decisions. So I think those two things give you the most, the reason for optimism, because eventually shots will fall, and he's not going to shoot 26% from three the entire year. His 2-point percentage has already started to increase over the past few games, and I do think him being in the starting lineup will only help him, because now he's playing off of the attention that a guy like Markkanen or Keyonte George is generating. So I do think, there have been signs of growth offensively just in terms of shot making, but as long as the other little things like the rebounding and the passing continue, I think that's what has been the most encouraging sign, from these first 11 games.
What do you think internally kind of the goals of the team are this season, given if you're working in that rebuild mode? I mean, of course, talent development would be key, but what other types of goals do you think internally that team is working on?
I think you kind of hit on it, actually. It's how can we create the best environment for our young players to grow, knowing that there is a large group of young players just on the roster. I do think this is not like a situation where we only have to play the young players. I think Will Hardy's message to the team and to the media, openly for the first leading into the season and over the first, 10 or so games has been that, this is not a season where you just get minutes as a young player. The team has enough vets, and the team has other young players that, if they're out competing you or just playing better, they might, cede your role in the rotation. And so I do think this is still a season of focused mainly on player development, but also, getting Lauri to bounce back. Markkanen had a pretty down year last year. He had this lingering back issue. There was not that much playmaking in the roster to kind of set him up for these off-ball actions. But he certainly looks back to, his level from at least 2 years ago, or maybe even the All-Star season. So I do think that is a focus of having him have a bounce back year. And then outside of that, it is player development. It is, let's hopefully get most of our rotation consisting of these young guys and have them grow. I mean, I think it's obviously early. I mean, I think we've seen some great strides from Keyonte George. Collier just came back over the weekend, so he's only played in 3 games. We talked about Ace Bailey, but there's even other guys, Kyle Filipowski, Taylor Hendricks, Walter Clayton Jr., Bryce Sensabaugh. I mean, there's so many guys to hit on potentially that I think the idea is if we can create the environment for these guys to grow and give them the chances to grow, we'll definitely take it if they grow and that leads to wins on the floor. They still want to build through the draft. They have a top 8 protected pick in the 2026 draft. But if the young guys are driving success, I think the front office would be very pleased with that.
Yeah, I mean, those are good goals, especially for a young team. I mean, because it's something that when you're in a rebuild, everybody kind of gets their favorite players, right? And sometimes there are people at the end of the bench, and they think, this person's going to be superstar someday. And then that player gets waived or traded because it's just how the rebuild goes. Who are some guys who are, aren't Ace Bailey or Kessler or Lauri or whoever that viewers should be keeping an eye on, who have some potential to kind of break out?
Yeah, I think some of the names I mentioned towards the end of that list, Kyle Filipowski, I think, has a really unique skill set for a big man on the offensive end. I mean, he can pass. At times, he's been a pretty good 3-point shooter. I think his skill set within the Jazz system makes a lot of sense. Similarly, alongside him and Taylor Hendricks, I mean, he had the injury last year that, not took him out of the year. And I think it was the third game of the season, that with the leg breaking. And it was really, I think this season is really more about just getting him minutes and reps. I don't think anyone is expecting him to kind of blossom, just recovering from this injury because he's missed a whole year of live game action. But he has the skill set defensively and ability to hit threes that, would be either complement to Filipowski's skill set or just a versatile kind of 3-and-D big, who can guard on the perimeter a little bit and maybe block some shots. And then Walter Clayton Jr., the other first round pick for Utah this past year. Obviously the 3-point shooting is the kind of main strength of his game, but I think he's been able to compete really well defensively and has been kind of a steadying presence in that backcourt spot. And so he can play on or off the ball, which I think is an intriguing potential combination with a guy like Isaiah Collier, who just kind of brings so much pace and playmaking. That having a shooter who can handle it like Walter Clayton Jr. Is another interesting player to keep on. And Bryce Sensabaugh just hit on quickly because last year I think he shot 42% from three. He's been a little bit cold this season, but if this guy is a consistent 40% threat from three and can sometimes create his own shot inside the arc, I think that is a guy that you would love to have coming off your bench as a six-man type of scorer.
I think talking about young players, there's a young player in Utah who will be in the draft next year. Is there a lot of buzz about AJ potentially being a high draft pick for the Jazz?
I mean, there's definitely buzz in the area just about AJ and BYU becoming this potential, college powerhouse. And I think there is, I think there's definitely an intriguing potential storyline there of him being at BYU and potentially being a top pick. I also think that, I'm not a college basketball guy, but from what I've heard, the top three, Darren Peterson, and Carlos Boozer's son, is it Cam Boozer is the good one? I think so. I know there's twins. So, I've heard that the top three is really, really good overall. And so I think that Jazz fans would be happy to add any dynamic player with that top pick. I think fans were really, really excited by the selection of Ace Bailey. I think fans were definitely hurt on lottery night when the Jazz fell to fifth. But then the way that the draft played out and they add Ace Bailey, who some thought could be a top 3 pick, I think that really excited the fan base. So I do think, adding another dynamic talent next year's draft would further that excitement.
Just out of curiosity, and granted we're in the month of November, the time of recording this podcast, so a bit of an unfair question, but given how things look right now and that we know that there's an injury to Walker Kessler, would it surprise you if the Jazz were active this upcoming trade deadline in a few months?
I mean, it's hard to say so early on. I do think, you get an injury to your starting center in Walker Kessler, who is, vital to the young core. But at the same time, there is a good amount of depth in the front court on the roster already, with a Taylor Hendricks, Kyle Filipowski, obviously Nurkic is starting. George Niang is going to be coming back soon from his injury that he suffered before the season started. They have Kyle Anderson in the front court as well. And even a guy like Oscar Tshiebwe, who's on a two-way, who did get called up for, I think, around 10 or 15 games last year, did have some impressive moments. So I do think, given just, if you're looking for depth in the front court, and obviously you can play smaller lineups, Lauri can shift to the 4 or even the 5 in some cases, and Ace Bailey could play at the 4. I think if you're looking for replacing Walker Kessler specifically, I think there's quite an amount of depth in the front court. But, obviously it's only November and the trade deadline's, 3 months away. So you never know what happens over the course of a season.
Awesome. Last question. Just wanted to get any other thoughts on the Jazz or the Western Conference in general, just any surprises from the early stages of the season that are jumping out to you?
I mean, I think, if you're looking at the West in general, I do think some of the early season results for a team like the Clippers is definitely jumping off the page. A team that, entered the season, maybe not with sky high expectations from the media, but they obviously had a good year last year and had what people considered to be a very good season. And they've been banged up. Today it was announced that Bradley Beal's out for the year. Leonard's dealing with an injury, and this is a very, very old team. So, a slow start to the season, you never know what could happen there. Do they have enough time to kind of recover in the standings? I think for the Jazz specifically, the Kessler injury was a big blow for, getting some more time with this young core playing together. But I do think just given the number of players that we've talked about in that young core, I think the season will continue to be very interesting in terms of the steps that they take. I think, Keyonte George, we didn't hit on too specifically, but he has made a lot of strides. I mean, he's not hitting his three ball well, but his 2-point finishing has made a significant increase and his playmaking has made a significant increase. And so if you're looking at a guy who could potentially be a starting point guard for the Jazz, that is one of those mainstay positions that teams are always looking for, having the guy at the point guard position. And some of the signs he's shown so far, maybe could believe that he could be that guy. But obviously I think the return of Isaiah Collier really can change things for this team offensively. And, they just scored 152 points last night, which is their 4th highest scoring game in franchise history. So
Wow.
not that they're not going to be that good the rest of the season offensively. Indiana Pacers also not in the Western Conference, but also one of those tough teams that you're kind of watching having one of those seasons from hell. But I do think there's still a lot of intrigue with this Jazz season, just how these young players continue to grow and can market and sustain this level of play to make another All-Star team.
Absolutely. All great things to keep an eye on. Really appreciate you joining our show, Eric, and your excellent insights on the Jazz and beyond. If you could, please let our listeners and viewers know where they can find your work, where they can follow you, and if you'd like to tease any upcoming projects.
Yeah, you can find all of my work at utahjazz.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at Eric Spyro NBA, I think is my handle. And it's not an upcoming project, but I actually just did kind of look back at the Utah Jazz Miracle in Miami game, which is, Paul Millsap has 46 points. The Jazz come back from being down, I think, 7 with 37 seconds left, and Paul Millsap scores 11 points in 28 seconds. They go into overtime, they get the win. This was like the 7th game of the Heat Big Three era, this was in 2010. And so I kind of tracked down a few players that played in that game and kind of got their insight onto what that moment was like. And so we published that. It was on Sunday because November 9th was the 15-year anniversary of that game. And so that's on utahjazz.com. It's also my pinned tweet on my profile. So that was just kind of a fun look back to this really significant moment in Jazz history.
Very cool. I remember that game well. We'll definitely be checking that out and encourage all you listeners, please check out Eric's work. Thank you again, Eric. Pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you.